Hello and welcome to this week's look at action and stunts on film and television. How are you? Well done. You've made it through another week. We are back on Friday and we're going to explore the life of a man you may have heard on Wednesday on the podcast. If not, go back and listen. It will be beneficial long term. Lots of pub quiz information that you can store away in that dark place, that place where you keep all of that information that everybody else thinks is pointless, when in point of fact you and I both know this is very useful. It will be kept to that moment when somebody will suddenly say, do you know who that guy was? And you go, I do know who that guy was. I know exactly who it was, and I can tell you a bit more about him. So that's the purpose of all of this. It's all educational, you know. We didn't have any of this at school when I was a kid. They used to throw a book on your desk and say, right, chapter 12, I need 1,000 words in 40 minutes about boot leather. And then you do your best and get marked down at the end of the... And I say this only on the basis that very recently I was over at my father's and I've seen some of my old school reports, which make for interesting reading, particularly in the field of writing and in the field of drama, which appeared to be the only two areas that I had excelled in any shape or form. The rest all seemed to be a bit of a mishmash. In fact, the majority of it was just me turning up every day, going through the motions and then going home. But nevertheless, looking at it now, in hindsight, it's very interesting to go back and go, really? That's what they said? How dare they? You wouldn't stand for it nowadays. And that's not a million miles away, he said, segueing beautifully into this week's episode, not a million miles away from the world that Roy Scammell started out in, although he decided he was going to go the military route. He was a physical PT instructor, and so had done a great deal of that as far as his physicality was concerned. And you'll note in some of this, his physical fitness is never in question. The man was... how old was he when I interviewed him? I interviewed him in 2018. That podcast that went out this week is an interview that we did. It was outside. He was late 80s, I would say, and still fit as a butcher's dog. Always wore a tracksuit, always wore trainers. I'm going to add a photograph here at some point of a stunt ball that I went to. And there's a photograph of me, Rocky Taylor, Frank Henson, and Roy Scammell all together. And it was primarily the fact that I turned up and I said to Rocky, is that Roy Scammell? I'd seen him on film, but I'd never met him. And he said, yeah. He said, he doesn't normally come out for these type of events, but that's definitely him. I said, well, I've got to get a photograph with him. And then Frank came over, who I knew what Frank looked like in later life. You know, you look at somebody and their appearance changes over time. So I was very familiar with Frank, huge fan of his, and a fan of Roy's. And I thought, I've got to get a photograph, an option. And so we posed for said photo, and it's a real cherished memory, I must say, because, you know, looking at it now, there's only me and Rocky left out of this lot, and it's a great shame that these boys had to go when they did. You know, they've had a wonderful life, don't get me wrong, and this episode is, you know, primarily a tribute to Roy Scammell, who, and you'll recognise him, and I've tried to, and some of the clips you see that I've put together. Maybe not movies that you will be terribly familiar with. Some you will be, some you won't be. But I've tried to do my very best to put a few bits and pieces together. We talked in the podcast about Clockwork Orange. He discusses and says that he brought his father. His father was a stuntman. John, his father. And he is one of the tramps who is beaten up in Clockwork Orange. Not the bloke in the underpass, but the guy sat on the steps. He said simply because the actor that they had employed couldn't get the timing right. And so he said it was much simpler. I brought my father in. And there's some bits and pieces about him talking about Alien as well, because Eddie Powell, of course, there's many photographs of Eddie Powell as the alien, in the alien costume. There's one very famous photograph of him in the alien costume drinking a cup of tea with the head off, so you can see it's Eddie, but he's in the costume. But a great deal of that testing and early work on behalf of Ridley Scott, who had said, look, is this plausible? And Roy has stepped up and said, well, I'll do it. I'll do the testing. The costume they had originally was really complicated, very bulky, very difficult to move in. And in point of fact, there was an original actor, and I have the feeling, somebody will put me right here, but could it have been Kevin Peter Hall? I know that he was a great creature guy, and later on worked as the costume character for Predator. Once that, also when I found this out, this scared me enormously. Once Jean-Claude Van Damme had stepped away from the project. Let that sink in for a moment. The Predator in Predator was originally Jean-Claude Van Damme. Yes. So Kevin Peter Hall stepped in, and it turns out, in Predator now, whether it's the same guy, there weren't that many very tall guys, unless they were playing basketball at that time for the Globetrotters, but that you saw on a regular basis. But he refers to a guy, doesn't mention his name, but he refers to him. I have assumed that it is. Maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Pop the details in the notes if you know differently. But the guy was claustrophobic and had a real issue. And of course, the costume itself, very, very... it's tight-fitting, and there's not a great deal of space. And if you are of the persuasion where you have an issue with space, then that's not the greatest position to be in, inside there. Anyway, he stepped away. Roy took over, did a great deal of that work, particularly the end sequence. So the first part of it is him, and then the second part, as the alien is fired out into space, is Eddie Powell. So they did it as a high fall. It's upside down. The set is upside down. They're all falling away. So that's how they worked that. But we had a very interesting time. I was fascinated by him. He has some remarkable stories. I've tried to put a few bits and pieces together to give you an idea of what work he was involved in. A couple of interesting stories coming along as well. So we'll have a look at that. We'll regroup afterwards, and here it comes. We start with Once a Jolly Swagman, 1949. It's about speedway riding, something that Roy knew a fair bit about. This is Bill Owen. You remember him from Last of the Summer Wine. He's going to come off his bike there, and then in comes Roy. Oh! And does that. We'll have a look at it again, because it's impact, and there's standard pads, you know. Cork helmet back in 1949, that was the standard. And nothing specific. There were no specifics there as far as major safety was concerned. Unbelievable stuff. I mean, really very, very exciting to watch. And of course, you know, doing this at the old Wembley Stadium, which is where a large proportion of this was filmed for the speedway sequences. But he could ride a motorbike, doubling Dirk, Bogarde, and a lot of the other actors as well in that. Rollerball, he was also responsible for as stunt coordinator. There was a great deal of action. Again, motorbikes. Again, they're throwing lots of fight routines in here. Use of that. Lots of exciting moments. Look at that, right out through. Oh my goodness, some of this is fantastic. I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but it's stuff like this that makes you want to have a look at it again. Bit of a fire sequence here as well. This is from a Peter Sellers movie called The Magic Christian. Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr. And here on the right, that's Charlie Hungerford, by the way, from Bergerac. And there is Roy. Didn't need much of an excuse to skimped down to his smalls to perform some form of, either it was wrestling or it was a fight or something. In here, in this particular instance, it's a peculiar sequence. If you've seen the movie, then you'll know. It's a kind of elaborate prank. There's Ringo trying not to... this guy, quick, take my number. Stuffs it into his shorts. And it's all getting a bit peculiar. Ta-da! Oh, my word. Now, this is from the movie Oliver, and on the right-hand side, you will see here, there is Roy and Malcolm Weaver, and the strong man is Reuben Martin. And he's the strong man there. This is Barry Lyndon, and that is, of course, Pat Roach fighting Ryan O'Neill. Now, the basis behind this, the idea that was pitched to Kubrick by Roy, was that he'd seen an Ali Frazier fight in the 70s, early 70s. And the idea was that Pat Roach would come out swinging, missing, and would get to the stage where he gets tired. He's putting a lot of effort into all of these punches. He's swinging, he's not landing anything. And all Ryan O'Neill is doing is dodging out of the way, and then hits him. So there was the idea that you would delay this to the longest possibility. And some of these angles, the way that they filmed them, and these punches are really good. Obviously, Pat throwing them left, right and centre. Here's one of Ryan's. Boom, boom, lovely. Oh, super. And they look very good. You know, there's no chance of any of these missing the target by the looks of things. I mean, they look really good. Now he's tired. What was it Ali said to Joe Frazier? And he may have said it also to a number of his other opponents. George Foreman would be one of them. Hell of a time to get tired, George, he used to say. And then would fight, would let them punch themselves out for a period of time, and then he'd take over. And these are great punches. And that's ultimately where this entire sequence came from. So my understanding is that on the page there was room for a fight between the soldier and Barry Lyndon. But it was never really classified until Roy had said, well, this is what I would do. How about we try this? And Stanley was pretty happy. And there we go. That's the little fight routine. Well worth checking out. There's a couple of other lovely moments in that as well. This is Saturn 3. He's doubling Kirk Douglas here, pushing this robot into the water. It's a great image in slow-mo, and then lots of the special effects going off. But it's the only action moment in the picture, but I like it very much. This is a movie called Going for a Take with Reg Varney. Now, he gets picked up here and chucked down the table. And on the left of the picture, and we'll just look at that there, that's Roy, and he just manages to catch stuff. Here's a high fall he does. Whee, bosh. Tucking late, as was his wont. And then Reg playing a stuntman, or trying to get away from villains. Here's another one later where he does a stair fall. Roy doing the stair fall for Reg Varney, doubling for the actress. Here's a moment as well, also in the picture, and of course he's the Tarzan double, so right, he comes along, and Tarzan, if you note, is actually Martin Grace. Stuntman Martin Grace is the character, and Reg Varney's doing the doubling for him. And there's a little fire job here, through the glass. The edit's terrible. They cut back to her, and then there's a guy going to put them out. That's it. There you go. So the interesting stuff, particularly in connection with Kubrick, Stanley Kubrick, and Barry Lyndon, because I think that was the I seem to remember Pat Roach mentioning that at it might actually have been a screening of it where he had attended many years later, but discussing with Roy and with Stanley Kubrick, I beg your pardon, although I'm sure Ridley would have been thrilled to have been part of Barry Lyndon in an official capacity. But working that out and coming up with the idea that, the boxer, the guy comes out and he's absolutely firing on all 4 cylinders, and he's throwing the kitchen sink at it, and he's a big guy, and Pat punch, gets tired, and then Ryan O'Neal steps in with minimal punching. It's not full-on attacks. These are very, very specific punches. And that was the idea behind it, was that it was based on a Muhammad Ali fight. I think it was Joe Frazier. Again, I remember in one of the Rumble, probably the one in the jungle, or something of that nature, where he says, "A hell of a time to get tired, Joe," and then beats 7 bells out of him because he's just absorbed a lot of those punches and then lets him go, So, interesting stuff there. A very typical Roy Scammell high fall, incidentally. You remember the very interesting Reg Varney movie that doesn't get shown very often, but it's on YouTube. They're not the greatest quality, but the shape, if you look at the shape of his body, it's very clearly Roy. It couldn't be anybody else. And again, over time, when you look at these performers, they have developed their own style. You remember I keep going back to the great Roy Alon because of his movement in the air. Compare that to Roy Scammell. Not a great deal of movement in the air. It is very simply a case of swan diving almost and then tucking for the landing. It's a very short distance. I would also urge you to check out a piece that is, there's a video on my channel, and it's stunt. I think it might actually be Roy Scammell at BBC Pebble Mill. For those people who are not familiar with the British light entertainment programmes of the 1970s and 80s, lunch times on BBC One, we used to have a television programme called Pebble Mill at 1. Pebble Mill was a BBC studio in Birmingham, and they would have, not necessarily, it was regionally based, but they had international singing stars, and they had actors and all sorts of bits and pieces, as an afternoon link between children's programming finishing and evening television. We still had a bit of a break in the afternoon, I seem to remember, and I was at school for a percentage of it, but I do remember it later on in life and checking it out. And consequently, there was an occasion where Roy did a high fall from the top of the building into a box rig, and he said himself, landing is absolutely crucial. My positioning here is crucial. And what happens now when you watch people who high fall, I think this was 60 or 65 feet, probably 60 feet. And they will fall and they will spot the landing and then will either turn over onto their back, flipping over, or will go into the tuck position for the roll. What's happened here is that Roy has simply fallen forwards, as he may have done in a live performance situation, falling into a box rig, but the height and the rotation has happened much faster maybe than he's anticipated, and he's gone over twice and landed on his face. Face planting into a box rig from 60 feet is not something that's advised. The presenter, you will see, who is describing what's gone on, in hindsight, I might add, it's a recording from later on, but he is saying, he got a black eye and a nose out here, and he says, "Do you want it again?" And so they did do one again, apparently later on, but the footage is there, so I urge you to go and see that. But again, a very specific shape to his body as he falls. You will be familiar, if you are Doctor Who fans, particularly in that John Pertwee period, where the Havoc team, the Derek Ware Havoc team, were involved with the action, and every time you see somebody falling off of anything, it is likely to be Roy. And later on in the year, we refer to in the podcast a documentary called Dying for a Living, which is a documentary about Derek, where we have obtained that, and later on in the year that will be put on the channel. So I look forward to your comments on that. It's well worth a watch. So that was Roy Scammell, sadly no longer with us. Roy, wherever you are, my friend, look after yourself. And there was a fly in the room. Did you see that? Unbelievable. So I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed that. We'll work that as a tribute to him. And next week we will come back with more of the same. And keep subscribing. If you've arrived by chance, go and subscribe. Go on, what's the worst that could happen? TikTok currently, may I say, if you are TikToking, TikTokers, is that how that works? Let's do that. If you are TikTok users, the channel is going really well at the moment. I've tried to put up bits and pieces every day. There's that fly again. Look at that. Let's get this office fumigated. What's going on? So, yes, the TikTok channel is going really well. There's some videos on there at the moment which are doing very well. My son was the one that said, you want to get on that TikTok, Dad. That's not how he talks, but you never know. You understand what I'm saying. But I wasn't familiar with it. He said, it's the biggest social media there is now, I said, really? He said, yes, get on it. So I've got on it with his instruction, and we're doing all right. So go and check those out. Go and like or follow, that's the word I'm looking for. Go and do that. Check out all the other social medias that are available, and the Pod Dojo network, who are responsible for the podcast. And we'll do it all again next week, shall we? Until then, it's bye for now.